seriously, is now the time to switch over to SSDs in your NAS? We all know SSDs have got their advantages, and dare I say, hard drives have got their cheeky little advantages too. But in this video, we're going to go through the four big ones. We're going to look at price, we're going to look at power consumption, we're going to look at noise, and of course, we're going to look at performance. And ultimately, by the end of this video, we're going to help you decide whether it is that now you should opt for SSDs inside your existing or up-and-coming NAS system, or whether you're better off sticking with hard drives, a good old faithful tried and tested method that's been there since the beginning. But straight out the gate, we should highlight right now that when we're talking about upgrading NAS systems like this to SSD, or indeed going for NAS systems that run purely on SSD, there are of course different kinds of SSD in the market. We have got things like 2.5-inch SATA SSDs, Kingston DC600M SSDs here, and then of course you've got M2 SSDs, the smaller, faster SSDs that, although again, power consumption may vary based on the utility, it's worth highlighting that NAS systems are rocking out the gate more and more right now, arriving with direct and dedicated M2 NVMe SSD support. Now, this video is going to focus a little bit more, I would say, on the SATA drives and the comparisons and advantages and disadvantages over hard drives. We will be touching on M2 NVMe throughout the course of this video, but one of the main reasons we're looking at SATA SSDs in this video is simply that the price has come down significantly on those compared with that of M2s. You know, example right now, cracking straight on with price. The price per terabyte of modern hard drives generally sticks somewhere between around 35 to about 40 nicker, depending on whether you're looking at Pro Series hard drives, looking at enterprise grade hard drives, or standard lower class drives for average home and lesser utilized use in a NAS server. Now, compare that with SSDs, and although they are still more expensive, the price difference has come down quite substantially. Normal SSDs that arrive in a SATA format, you can get 4 TB. The average price of a 4 TB SATA SSD from recognized brands sits at somewhere between $249 to about £275 quid. Think about your tax and your conversions there. So when you compare the price difference of a 4 TB hard drive at about 100 quid, it's about, the ratio is about 2.5 times the price there. Now, once we look at M2 NVMe's, there's a slight disparity there. Although I was able to find 4 TB M.2 NVMe's, a couple of brands there. One of them was the Lexar that we featured on the channel before, and Crucial as well as another brand that has engaged with that. I would still say overall that the majority of M.2 NVMe's at Gen 3 and Gen 4 level, when you get to 4 TB, the ratio is about 3 to 4 times the price that of hard drives there. So if what you care about the most is price, unsurprisingly, hard drives are going to be the better price point for you there. And the same goes for capacity, by the way. When I've been focusing there on 4 TB, the reason I went for 4 TB there is, of course, that the majority of SSDs cap at 4 terabytes because of the alignment of the NAND and the controllers there on board on these smaller PCBs. To put it into perspective, an SSD in M.2 doesn't have a huge amount of physical surface area to play with, and the number of chips they can put on there, and therefore the capacity being read from, is therefore limited. You can get both M.2 NVMe's arriving in Gen 3 and Gen 4, as well as SATA-based SSDs as well. They go up to 8 terabytes. I've seen 8 TB drives knock around for about 500 nicker in some places, and when it comes to M.2 SSDs, we've seen 8 TB drives around the 600 or 700 nicker price tag there. Now, hard drives, on the other hand, you know, the threshold and the maximum capacity is always rising. In the case of this, for example, we reviewed this recently on the channel. This is our Seagate Ironwolf Pro hard drive there. This drive is a 24 terabyte drive. It'll set you back somewhere in the region, including your tax, about 500 or 600 quid. But that is a huge amount of capacity. So once you think about that, that means for the price of 8 TB of Gen 4 performance, you can get 24 terabytes. And yes, the performance is lesser, sitting there at about 285 megabytes per second versus 7,000. But nonetheless, the price-wise, hard drives are always going to maintain that advantage. But it should be highlighted once again that SATA SSDs are closing the gap. Now, we could talk a lot about durability, but I will say when it comes to durability, there's a lot of grey. area between the black and the white numbers there. When it comes to hard drives, for example, hard drives, more often than not, although there is a figure known as MTBF or MTTF, mean time between failure, etc., that as a market benchmark has kind of gone away in recent years in favour of something called workload limits and terabytes written, and ultimately the amount of data you can write to a drive over time. Now, going back to that Seagate drive here, this 24 TB drive, it's a Pro class drive, but it also has an enterprise grade durability there at 550 terabytes written annually over 5 years. That's the write limit of this before you get to a point where Seagate will check the statistic numbers recorded there within the logs of the drive and say that drive, if it has exceeded that number, has therefore exceeded what we deem to be a sensible amount of write to happen to that drive within its effective lifespan. Now, when it comes to SSDs, things are slightly different. There are two numbers that are provided: TBW, terabytes written, but also drive writes per day, generally presented as a decimal place number. Drive writes per day, as a name may suggest, is, for example, this drive at 480 gig. If this drive was rated at 1 drive writes per day, that means within the 5-year period that it's covered, you can write 480 gig every single day, and the drive should still work well within the parameters there. All good stuff. But then durability does get grey, because then you start getting into the components that are used on these drives. The NAND, the flash storage that the data lives on, has varying degrees of quality and performance there. Generally marketed as SLC, MLC, TLC, and finally QLC. These all represent different depth qualities and layer counts of the individual cells there. And the larger the capacity on SSDs, you tend to find, particularly in SATA SSDs, but less so with M.2 SSDs, that the NAND drops in quality from TLC, triple layer cells, to QLC, quad layer cells. And that means these SSDs not only give you lesser performance, but also these SSDs can't withstand the same amount of write activity over time. The same goes to their power efficiency being nowhere near as good as well. That's what I mean about gauging the durability of hard drive versus SSDs, because it really isn't 1 versus 1. It's actually about 5 versus 20 different kinds, and therefore it becomes very difficult to pigeonhole that down. Ultimately, if you take your durability seriously, both media types have varying kinds of scale durability up and down. That obviously scales counter to the price point, as you would not be too surprised by. Ultimately, that's why we don't really pigeonhole a hard drive versus SSDs when it comes to durability, because there's so many different factors at play. Okay, so first up we can look at the DS93 populated with those 4 Kingston SSDs in a RAID 5. Unsurprisingly, power consumption was pretty darn low. The lowest it's going to be throughout the whole of this video, sitting neatly at around 19 to 20 watts. When it came to noise levels when in idle, well, I'll let it speak for itself. Moving over to active use, by active, what we had here was performance tests happening on 3 of the drives and a drive health management tool going through the 4th drive there. All 4 drives were active simultaneously, and while this was going on, I also had Plex Media Server running on the existing storage pool, and that was indexing media on the drives. The CPU was always at around about 80 to 85% throughout, and as you can see from the power consumption, it's leapt up from that round about 20 watt mark and now gone up to the 32 to 33 watt mark. The fan noise increased, but really that was it. Listen for yourself. Now switching over to the exact same system using Toshiba 8TB hard drives, obviously we expected there to be differences in both noise and power level, and indeed in idle, as you can see there on the right hand side of the screen, it effectively doubled our our idle power consumption, living there between 39 and 40 watts during idle there. Likewise, noise, as you can probably hear in a second, you can hear the fans, but it's the occasional tick and whir and hum of those drives that stands out, but only marginally. Which brought us to arguably the noisiest period of the majority of time with this system. With all 4 drives being accessed heavily, as well as the whole system being accessed heavily, we saw power consumption numbers of in excess of 58 watts throughout the course of that testing. But it was really the noise of these MG drives being constantly hit by the barrage of benchmark and data consistency checks that we saw happening, where the drives were really audible. Moving over to performance, it would be really easy to just flat out say SSDs are faster than hard drives. Obviously they're going to be better, but I think the reality is just a little bit more nuanced than that. As you can see here on screen, we're running a 4GB test file on AJA over 10GBE using an SMB mapped network drive. All 4 drives, respective to the Kingston or the Toshiba SSDs and hard drives respectively, were in a RAID 5 array on an ext4 volume there. As you can see between the both of them, even with the MTU opened up, thereby pretty much ensuring the best data packet transmission we could have, the performance numbers were extraordinarily different across both platforms there. With AJA performing on the SSDs a consistent full saturation of 10GBE constantly, and half the performance there have 4 of those drives being read from, the hard drives that is. Also bear in mind a couple more things, that the SSDs, if anything, are being bottlenecked. 4 SSDs, SATA or otherwise, in a RAID 5 environment would exceed 1 GBE quite comfortably. So that 1000 you're seeing them hitting is actually them being bottlenecked, whereas in the hard drive sense, you have multiple hard drives being read and written to, and therefore the numbers you are seeing are as good as it gets, really, for that setup. And it's the latency and it's the sustained performance that really stands out, because whereas the hard drives when they're being read and written to generally go down over time, the SSDs seemingly maintain that high number, and if anything, thanks to the way SSDs work and they warm up, actually improve in performance in some ways. Now this performance difference in both the speed and quality extended to when we did the same file size of 4GB on Crystal Disk. Again, exactly the same setup, the same storage areas across the two. But what I really want you to take in there isn't just high number be better, such as on the top left there you can see that the SSDs cranked out 1223 megabytes per second, actually technically oversaturating, possibly a miscalculation, and the right fully saturating the 10GBE, whereas in the case of the hard drives, hitting 496 megabytes up and down, only half saturating that 10GBE pipe. But the thing I really want you to look at is the third number down. The third number down is the IOPS. Now IOPS are going to give you that heightened performance on SSDs quite substantially, ultimately meaning that those SSDs are not only able to give you that higher peak traditional transfer performance, but also that the IOPS performance there did translate in the confines of the NAS. You actually saw that 100,000 100,000 read IOPS there being translated extraordinarily well, which would be great for VMs, and ultimately any task that requires low latency would see the benefits here. I think this really demonstrates that the SSDs not only give you that traditional good performance, but that the IOPS there were quite substantial, which is going to be great for those high volume, large scale databases, not just big, fast, traditional data. Which brings us to Atto Disk Benchmark, once again a 4GB file, and this time what I really want you to look at there is consistency. The SSDs, once again, obviously, and I know the text is quite small, will obviously saturate in the full bandwidth of the 10 GBE quite substantially, hitting well in excess of 9 to 950 megabytes per second write, and hitting that 1.1 gigabytes per second read, and that is with a margin of error, ultimate full saturation on the SSDs. Whereas in the case of the hard drives, we were still seeing those reasonable numbers with a few kind of sporadic numbers there. But the real thing there was a lack of consistency, a lack of sustained numbers that would be arguably predictable. Ultimately meaning that when you have the hard drives in that RAID 5 array, the long-term read and write are not going to be as constant on the hard drive RAID array as they're going to be on the SSDs. As the data and the parity is being calculated across those disks, the mechanical nature of read and write and the way data is maintained on those disks across the RAID does ultimately, result in a drag factor, if you will, which is always going to be the case on mechanical versus that of solid state drives. Ultimately, this has really demonstrated overall just that SSDs is not just about going really, really fast. It's about sustained performance, and it's about how it deals with small and large file types and, dealing with those packets of data consistently over a sustained length of time. I think we can all agree that in a perfect world, all of us would like to utilize SSDs inside our NAS. They utilize less power, they get the job done quicker, and they are significantly quieter. But the price tag is still not as attractive, price per terabyte, as that of hard drives. And we know this, it's getting better, but we're still not quite there. Year on year, we see media outlets talk about how hard drives are dying and hard drives aren't going to be around next year. And it's simply not true. The cost benefits of hard drives, be it at data center level or simply in the home, are just too damn irresistible, and companies like Seagate and WD scaling up towards the 50 TB, 100 TB and greater drives in the future by 2030, it should be highlighted again, hard drives aren't going anywhere. That said, we would love it if SSDs became the status quo, but maybe they will. I personally think if you are interested in having the most efficient system possible, SSDs are the best way out there to get that. Again, because the lesser power consumption, less time to get the average job done, and of course the noise and the energy dissipation that happens throughout these systems in operation. But until their capacity numbers, not so much the price per terabyte, but definitely just the overall capacity available on SSDs to consumers, less so businesses with the mad enterprise scale SSDs in the market, until those SSDs are available in that comparative scale, I just don't think they're going to, win overall. And that's why hard drives with SSDs is going to be a debate we're going to have in 5 to 10 years from now still. Nevertheless, I hope that you found this video helpful and some part of the evaluation of hard drives and SSDs in these systems has been useful to you and your setup. Let me know in the comments if it has. Apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.